Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this, what is promising to become a very exciting conversation. Uh, we speak about societal collapse and how museums can be lifeboats in that situation with the author of the book, Robert James, uh, Avi and Marsha, who most of you know and were with us last year in a series called Change is Required, are joining us again this year in a new program, in a new series. This is the start of that series. Every other month, we will come together and discuss forgotten or suppressed narratives in museums. So I hope that you will be looking forward to that series. We will go for another 6 or 7 months here, alternating with other topics, but I will talk about that later. So we're very excited to have Avi and Marsha joining us today again, and their suggestion to have Robert James to speak about his book. And as someone not later than this morning told me, I will be there because Robert has always something to say. So I'm really looking forward to listening to you. I'm going to disappear and leave the floor to Marsha to take the lead here. Thank you so much, and I see you at the end.
Thank you so much, Walter, and welcome to all of you. I think this is indeed a special occasion. Robert's latest book, Museums and Societal Collapse, The Museum as Lifeboat. I can tell you, as soon as I saw it in the Routledge catalog, I put in my advanced order for it. And so my copy arrived, and I've been a student of it. Although I have to say, I've been a student of Bob James's work since the first book of his that I read, Museums and the Paradox of Change. And for me, the significance of what Bob has done in many writings and articles and books is to always marry the social and community role of museums, the why of museums, with the need to create a museum culture that values museum workers in a respectful way and links the two, how our outward facing work and our inward facing work has to be of a piece. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. Avi, I'll turn it over to you for your brief remark, and then we'll turn it over to Bob.
Thank you very much, Marsha, and welcome to everybody. I'm delighted to have an opportunity to hear from Bob James today about his newest book on two very different counts. One is that I am in entire sympathy with his premise that we are on the verge of societal collapse and that the maelstrom of crises that we have been confronting during the last few years really does mark a sea change in our societies and in our culture, and certainly in the way museums have to go about their practice. And the second is that he has been an absolute exemplar of reflective thinking about museums for the last 25 or 30 years, book after book. And one of the things that makes this book particularly pertinent is that it's systematic in its analysis. It's not a one idea book. And it takes itself very seriously and goes into depth and nuance about the issues that we are all facing. So I feel that this is a moment of novelty for museums, and I think Bob is one of the few people out in the field who's taking that novelty with extreme seriousness. Bob, would you care to say a few words yourself?
Well, thank you both, Marsha and Avi, for those generous words. And for inviting me, Walter and Colleen, to participate in this discussion. I think I want to begin with my land acknowledgement, though, before I go into some more general comments. So in the spirit of respect and reciprocity and truth, I want to honor and acknowledge the Canmore area in Alberta where I live, which is the homeland of the Stoney Nakoda First Nation. I also acknowledge the Treaty 7 of the Tsuut'ina First Nation and Blackfoot Confederacy, which consists of the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai. The territory is also home where I live to the Métis Nation of Alberta. And last, I'm deeply honored to have been given a traditional Blackfoot name. Couple of other things just to begin with. We really are in need of urgent, thoughtful, and frank conversations, and I really hope that this is going to be one of those. And of necessity, I often offer a qualifier because I'm going to have to generalize about various things, because I know very well that there's some outstanding museum work going on to address some of the things that concern me. But in my overview, it's simply not enough. So consider that some of these things are generalizations, and I hope I don't offend the people that are already committed. I also have to admit I'm a little bit intimidated because I spent 16 months mostly doing the research and writing this book, and now we're going to attempt to summarize it in an hour. So I'm going to leave that to Marsha and Avi's good organizational skills. But then when I think about that, I think, actually, I was able to spend the better part of 16 months writing a book with food, with water, with a home, with peace and security. And when I look every day at what's going on in the world, I really do believe we have a lot to be grateful for.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bob, for all of those words. You know, I have to say, as much of a Bob James groupie as I am, and I've been, as I read the beginnings of the book, where you synthesize all these different types of collapse that society is now facing: financial, commercial, political, social, and cultural. I was taken aback a bit, and I'd never seen the word collapsology before. So maybe you could talk a little bit about your reasoning for this notion of collapse. I know you've done a lot of research. And why do you think that the events of recent years are more than a series of navigable crises, and instead herald the potential collapse of civil society as we know it?
Thank you, Marsha. I think because climate trauma, and I've stopped using the word climate change, that's absurd, and that's now being used by climate deniers. I've stopped using the word emergency and crisis. I now call it trauma because there's trauma occurring very close to where most of us live, not to mention, say, the global south. And that's because we're in this polycrisis now, and climate trauma is only one symptom. We're in the midst of a polycrisis where there are multiple interconnected stressors that over time are creating vast complexity that we're now experiencing every day as we listen to the radio and watch TV. And these threads, and there are many of them, they include ecological overshoot, which is the destruction of the natural environment, civilizational overshoot from our unbridled consumption, climate trauma, government incompetence, corporate deceit, the eco-modernists who somehow think that we can just get green technology and carrying on living the way we're living now, which is a myth that we might get into a bit later. Wealth inequality, climate refugees, warfare, authoritarianism. They're all now mixed up and interrelated, and they constitute this polycrisis. And that really motivated me to sit down and try to put pen to paper on this book. Because in the final analysis, the planet can no longer sustain how we live. The footprint of the planet is now 1.75 planets. And we really have no choice, as far as I'm concerned, but to begin the contraction of our consumptive society. We're going to have to start getting used with less. It may be a slow sort of descent into more difficult things. And I don't know if it's avoidable. And I guess I can also say, to sum up this question, that this whole thing, climate trauma, the polycrisis, it's no longer theoretical or academic for me for two reasons. One is that just this past summer, our daughter and her family who live in northern Canada had to escape the wildfires, and they lived with us for a month. And secondly, our son owns a farm and a forest, and all his cedar trees now are dying because of climate-induced warming and lack of water.
Thank you.
So it's personal.
Yeah.
Thank you. In fact, we do see these crises in very concrete and personal terms. During the last 3 years, I know of nobody who has not been affected in very fundamental ways since the onset of the pandemic in North America. Bob, it seems to me that you are very critical of what you term the madness of modernity, and particularly the all-pervasive idea of progress. In your view, what will museums need to do to challenge prevailing ideas rather than to celebrate them?
Well, E.O. Wilson, the entomologist who died recently, and the environmental activist, kind of summed that whole thing up very nicely in my view. And he said that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. So that's a pretty dire recipe, but I think there are ways to deal with it. And I think that for museums, the first thing they must do is to sit down and rethink and start talking about their current vision, missions, and values. And values, are sort of overlooked, or maybe thinking, well, the consultant has recommended values. Really not that important, but in fact, they really are, because they really are about how you want to treat people and how you want to be treated yourselves. So I think in doing that vision, mission overhaul, values have to be a key component of that. And at the very top of the list is asking the question why when you sit down to look at the work you're doing. Why are you doing what you're doing? Because every time I've asked that question with other people, with colleagues, it always provokes discussions about issues that are important in one's personal life, but also in one's work life and in one's community. So that question is really a key lever in reaching for more meaning. That may, in fact, even lead to an advocacy policy where the staff, the board, volunteers sit down and decide after this discussion, what are the key civic and moral issues that we're interested in and where we may be able to provide some value. And that could lead to an advocacy policy. They're still very rare. And I think Nina Simon was actually the first one to actually draft an advocacy policy. And you can find that online if you're looking for a template. They're not very popular right now. I would also suggest that that we as museum people become reality-based. Let's really start to pay attention to what's going on in the world, beyond our internal concerns about audience development and leisure entertainment and marketplace consumption. Let's get real about the real issues. And that, I think, is also going to make us more reflexive and focus on relationships between people rather than the relationship between the authority of the museum and the resources of the museum, which always seem to be a constant focus in the museum world. And to sum that up, I think that museums actually have three obligations as agents of cultural change and forces for good. And that is they have to be open to influence and impact from outside the museum, not just from your museum colleagues. They have to be responsive to citizens' interests and concerns. And then I think they have to be fully transparent in doing those first two things. I don't know, Marsha, you want me to keep going on here? I mean, I've got more, but I know we're short on time.
I think I'll turn it over to Avi for the next question, and then I think I'm ready to move on. Avi?
Maybe if I could just add one thing, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think that museums also, in response to Avi's question, they have ethical responsibilities, whether it's public advocacy or problem solving or collaborating with other organizations on the funding of mutual solutions. Also a good one, insisting on the accountability of government. And I applaud Sarah Sutton and the We Are Still In movement for holding the Trump government to account when he refused to show up at COP. And that has a lot of museum organizations in it. So this notion of insisting on the accountability of government is not a far out idea, because Sarah and her colleagues are actually doing it. I still think, and I know people will lament my saying this, but museums are still responsible for generating knowledge, for doing scientific and humanities research, where and when appropriate. And lastly, this profoundly important thing, I think, now is maintaining your collections as knowledge seed banks, because if we get into some kind of apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic slide, we need this record of the achievements of our civilization in order to go forward and to learn from. So sorry for that addendum there, but
no, I actually I'm grateful, because you're bridging not only from the ominous state of the world to the role that museums can play with the resources we have, with the assets we have, and with some of the trust that we have. Although you argue it's not always well earned, and we need to do more to earn it. But I like that pivot. Avi, I'll just let you ask another question.
Good. Well, Bob, it seems to me that you are while still hopeful and optimistic, perhaps in my view, over-optimistic about how far museums can go in responding to the realities that you've just outlined. It does seem to me that there's been a limited sense of urgency across the field to deal with these macro issues and the crises that they generate. Among the factors you cite are the corporate model of museum structure, the lack of flexibility, originality, and collaboration, and lack of personal agency among museum staff. But can you elaborate on why you see museums lagging in self-transformation at this very urgent juncture?
Well, I'm glad, Avi, that you brought up this notion of transformation, because when you think about it, museums have transformed themselves over a long period of time, very slowly, with difficulty, because you think we began as imperial collections looted from around the world. We slowly morphed into centers for public education and informal learning outside the formal learning system. And in my career time, we've become the museum as mall, as an appendage to consumer society, where the only thing that counts is earned revenues and how much stuff you sell and how many people come through the door. And I think museums have much more potential than the museum as mall model. So now we're actually at a watershed. We can make a choice now to become significant civil society organizations and truly commit to community, individual, and family well-being. So I think transformation has been demonstrated by museums, and I think it can continue. But we got a problem, because I think that now museums are failing to see that we are really in the midst of extraordinary societal upheaval. It is not business as usual, and that museums cannot stand on the sidelines as civil organizations. They have to contribute, they have to participate. And to do that, numerous things I think have to happen. I mean, first is this notion of leadership. I think that the museum community has uncritically adopted the lone CEO, the corporate leadership model, where the director, call it the director, the CEO, the executive director, they have way too much responsibility and they have way too much authority. Because in this world of increasing complexity, leadership is really about the group. It's not about some sort of lone CEO or hero who has the whole vision and process in his or her mind. I think accompanying that, I mean, that lone CEO model has resulted in a very sort of brittle hierarchy, which has all sorts of implications, from personal agency to how to allowing authority and responsibility to go as deep into the organization where the work can be done well. So they have to think about new organizational models, flatten the organization. We should begin to study much more self-organization, how it works, because really self-organization is about small group culture. And small group culture is so important in the museum world because of the size of institutions, the intimacy of co-workers, and the fact that in small group cultures, values are shared, beliefs are shared, work is shared. And Avi, you mentioned, or I think maybe Marsha did, this notion of personal agency. That's a person's ability and willingness to take action in the world. And I would add, to make it a better place. But in my experience, there's almost a shutting down of personal agency. So many museum workers are intelligent, committed. They lead interesting lives. They may be an artist, they may be an environmental activist, but somehow they're supposed to sort of check their brains at the museum door and become a museum employee rather than a true, full person. And I think that personhood is going to be so important in enriching the activities of the museum as we begin to embrace these complex issues. I don't know. I think maybe I should stop there.
Yeah, because I just like to jump in fact, and Bob, actually, that's how I first got to know you, when you were using the example of your work at the Glenbow Museum to deal with new ways of managing, organizing, distributing leadership, and so on. So I'm not surprised, but I'm still heartened that you've developed that even further in this new book. And, you know, one of the things that in our book, Change is Required, we had a whole chapter on that we subtitled "The Turn to Digital." And as you know, a lot of museums and other organizations, look at us, we're on Zoom right now, have felt that there's something in digital resources, social media, and so on that can take us in some way further in solving some of these problems. But I don't think that's what you believe from your book. So would you talk a little about that? Because again, I put that under the umbrella heading of that MTI, the modern techno-industrial society, and our confidence that solutions can be found through reliance on the digital technology.
Yeah. Just as an aside, I mean, it strikes me that we develop newer technologies to deal with the problems that the previous technology created. And I don't know when that deadly cycle is going to end. But back to your question, I might be getting too cynical, because I think that these things like digitization, virtual reality, social media are the sort of the latest silver bullets to help enhance the museum's meaning and establish its worth. And to me, they're huge distractions from the real issues. And that is, we've already hit on a bunch of them. Museums have a lot of deep structural problems that have been ignored and that are old fashioned, and they need replacing. They need reformation. They need transformation. And these technological gadgets and widgets, I think, are just distracting the people who could actually be dealing with these issues. And until these sort of core foundational things are dealt with, digitization and virtual reality isn't going to get us anywhere. And it's certainly not going to help us confront this poly crisis that I discussed earlier, because the pressures on museums have gone far beyond now money and popularity and that sort of thing. They include climate trauma, they include social justice, and all those other issues that I mentioned earlier when we started this conversation. And I think museums have to become much more aware of what things they adopt from the private sector, because we know that business literacy is absolutely important to a healthy and competent museum. But when the final analysis, business is about methods and techniques. It's not about values. And I think that a lot of our colleagues have become a bit mistaken. And rather than emphasize values, they're putting all their emphasis on the marketplace and business literacy. And I think that is really retarding the potential of museums to fully equip the lifeboat. But as you mentioned a few minutes ago, Marsha, there's already a lot of tools and life jackets and maybe some shark repellent already in the lifeboat.
That's right. Thanks.
Well, so if I could just interrupt, Marsha, I'm so sorry. We had a couple of questions pop up in the chat, and there was some significant chat around this advocacy policy, Bob, that you mentioned a little bit earlier, and folks did want a little bit more information about that. But we also had an inquiry about just the political polarization that is going on at the moment and how to best, I don't know, reduce that within the museum environment to actually communicate, missions and visions and what our hopes are for society at large.
So the first one is about a little bit more on the advocacy policy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, I started thinking about this because when I would talk up, I've been actually working on the climate file for 20 years. And I've been talking a lot about it to friends, colleagues, families. And, for the longest time, up until recently, probably the last 3 years, people would say, well, that's a political issue, and we're a museum and we are neutral and we don't get involved in politics. But there are so many issues out there that are not political issues. They're moral, they're civic, they're social, they're cultural. I mean, climate change, I'll use that word, I guess, is a classic example, because there's a 97% scientific consensus that global warming is human-induced. That's not a political issue. So to use, I'm not going to get involved in politics to ignore the climate crisis, it's nonsense. And that's true of so many issues. So in drafting this advocacy policy, you need to have the discussion about what civic and moral issues are important, and then do the deep dive in there and see whether, in fact, they are scientific or just political. But I'm pretty sure that most of these issues we're dealing with are not only scientific, they are moral, they're about justice, they're about all kinds of things. So
and if I can just, talking about political polarization, which obviously is a reality these days, one of the things that Bob talks a lot about are the kind of soft skills museum people have and can make more potential of in terms of community conversations, creating space around some of these issues. So I apologize, Bob, for interrupting you before you got into that.
I mean, I agree completely. And I would just add to Marsha, I mean, museums are already equipped to engage in critical thinking, to facilitate conflicts and consensus, to help people cope, to mentor, and to host community conversations. And we have to realize that the latest figure I saw, there are 95,000 museums in the world, give or take. They are the largest self-organized franchise in the world. McDonald's restaurants doesn't even come close with 30,000. And the thing about them that's unique is they're public storefronts. They're on the street. They're welcoming. I mean, most people aren't going to go to a university campus for a public conversation. And the corporate world cares nothing about that sort of openness. So museums are so ideally placed to do what Marsha's talking about, to offer these soft skills. And I think in the course of it, help this reconciliation between this political polarization, because nobody's actually focusing on it.
Bob, I actually think that some of these issues are in fact political, and I don't think that we should shy away from that reality. There's a new movement out there called TWP, Thinking and Working with Politics. It seems to be that as social or civic institutions, we're engaged in political activity in the broadest sense of the term in our communities, and that we should not be frightened about that. We may want to avoid strictly partisan political stances, but there's no reason not to talk about public issues directly and openly, it seems to me. And obviously there are certain risks about it, but I don't think we're apolitical institutions at all. And a lot of these issues are certainly not apolitical at all. Be that as it may. I want to push you, though, about a really hard question that you yourself have posed, and that is, you have asked about museums, why aren't we asking ourselves, what do we need to reform or retain? What do we need to jettison? Which, by the way, is the $64 question for most museums. Nobody wants to give up anything. No. And what do we need to reconcile? And do you have some particular or concrete responses to those three questions about museums in general?
Yes, I do, Avi. But back to the political, I mean, point well taken. Maybe we need a better word, but I guess I'm also cynical about politicians. I was listening to John Valiant on the radio the other day, and he's the one that just wrote the book on wildfires. And he went and documented the largest wildfire in Canadian history in Fort McMurray, where the entire town was burned down and people had to evacuate. And he went to a parliamentary political committee meeting. And he said he walked into the room, presented his whole thing, and he said it was as if everybody in the room was on lithium. He said there was no energy, there was nothing. So I guess I'm a bit cynical about the political system right now. But back to your question, yes, in terms of restoration, now when I say restoration, that may imply that it once existed, but sometimes it's not the case with some of these examples. I go back to the four agendas: the why, the what, the how, and the for whom. I think that has to get back on the agenda with a vengeance, especially the question why. I think this notion of supporting personal agency, I've already mentioned that it's so important. It's for the managers and the leaders to get off their backs, get off the staff's backs, trust them, agree on what the outcome should be, and then devolve the authority and the responsibility so staff can get on with the work in the best way that they know how. I think that's being forgotten, and I don't know exactly why. I mentioned too that we could enhance the community self-sufficiency through what Marsha said earlier about the soft skills. And I mentioned those: critical thinking, helping people cope, mentoring. those need to be restored to the museum as a knowledge-based organization, a sensitive organization. And there's another then really big topic that I guess we can't say we restore because it doesn't exist, but that's this notion of elders in our society. Our society has no elder culture, unlike many Asian cultures and indigenous cultures. And elders have so much to offer in terms of their wisdom and knowledge compared to the superficiality of the digital world. And I'm not just talking about, elders in the museum community, but elders throughout a community and from all sorts of sectors. We really need to start to draw on those millennia of accumulated years of experience and knowledge. So you wanted to talk about jettisoning too, right, Avi? I think the first one is to get rid of this notion of neutrality, which has been such an obstacle to museum fluorescence and to museums fulfilling their potential. And that goes back to the political, like we were talking before, and the advocacy policy. But neutrality is really getting to be a pretty poor excuse in this day and age. I think that we need to stop claiming that museum missions are special and unique and somehow don't have to be accountable to society at large, and somehow they're different from everything that we're doing. And I would say that we need to let go of our sense of entitlement. We've had that for a long time. I think neutrality has been the basis of the sense of entitlement, but it's really now time for all hands on deck. And I think if we got rid of at least those four things, it would go a long way to museums expanding, their notion of their responsibility.
Thank you.
One of our younger colleagues, by the way, thought that what we really need to jettison is the word permanent.
Oh, that too. Yeah.
Well,
nothing's permanent now.
And one of the things that stuck out to me, Bob, in reading the book was this growth mindset. Which is beyond the museum sector, obviously, but this notion that, and I think Avi referred to it a little earlier, this notion that we're on this progress. Growth and progress are the same thing. And in fact, you even suggest thinking about degrowth and the role of the museum, again, through conversations, but also through thoughtful reflections about their why and for whom, and what needs to be done at this moment in our society. Maybe we have to think about, as Avi alluded to before, degrowth, getting smaller and really shrinking down to our essentials. So maybe you could say a couple of things about that, and then I've got a kind of follow up. But I'd love to hear you talk about.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, the growth myth, because I mean it's really what's killing the planet and what's portending collapse. This notion that continuous economic growth is essential to our well-being, and all we have to do is keep increasing the gross domestic product, and everything is going to be okay. I mean, it's a complete hoax, it's a complete lie, and it's destroying the planet. And I think that when I look around, many museums are still committed to that growth myth. And one of the expressions of the growth myth is this vanity or conceit architecture movement, which is still well in place, where hundreds of millions of dollars are spent on one-off buildings with the notion that build it and they will come. And I guess it works for about a year, but every time we look at these projects, there's never enough money to run the new building. Operating budgets are cut, staff are lost. So we really don't need any more museum buildings. We've got at least 95,000, I think, and we don't need any more. So the growth myth has to stop. And I think this commitment to buildings has to stop because they become a huge distraction, which distract everyone away from the mission and the work and the values of the museum. Again, that's a highly personal opinion. I'm sure I'm annoying some people right now by saying that, but it's something I've observed in my career.
Well, I had the good fortune of spending some time working with Alan Friedman from the New York NYSCI, the New York Science Institution. And he used to give our colleagues an exercise, which was your museum has burned down, it's disappeared. How are you going to achieve your mission? And that kind of was the opening to a whole set of new thoughts, and actually, and in some cases, in museums around the world, new actions, when in fact a typhoon, say, had leveled their museum. So I appreciate that very, very much. I wanted to.
That's a highly creative question.
Yeah, it does cause useful reflection.
Can I just mention one more thing that we should get rid of?
Please.
And that's the stupid organization. And that's actually a focus of study now by social science researchers. And the stupid organization is one where you hire experienced, intelligent, committed staff, and then you don't let them do anything. You know, you don't show them your budget. They don't know what money they have to accomplish tasks. And you don't like them to think and reflect too much because it sort of might upset preconceptions. That's the stupid organization. And museums are not immune from being stupid that way. I mean, I think it happens in any complex organization. But it goes back to personal agency. We've got to give staff the authority and the responsibility to get on with the work. And that's going to do a lot to lessen the stupidity.
Amen. Let's hear it for transparency. I wanted to move to a related question. I mean, the problems and challenges that you described that we're facing are, as we know, complex, wicked problems. They don't have a single answer. Uncertainty is a theme that runs through your book, and the fact that we have to get comfortable with uncertainty. But you also talk about the fact that museums can't be islands. And our good friend Gail Anderson has talked about, museums not being islands. But can you talk a little about that role of a museum within a network and an ecosystem of other organizations of civil society? And what seems to be holding museums back from fully embracing that role in a way that can truly make a difference?
Yeah. Well, there's sort of three kinds of ecological relationships. There's dependent ones, independent ones, and interdependent ones. And I think museums have really limited their focus to dependency. I mean, they're dependent on funding sources, whether it's government, public, or donor, private, foundation, or whatever. They also claim to be independent in many cases when they say, just give us the money, we know what to do. And I experienced a lot of that when we introduced the strategic planning into Canada. And a lot of people said, well, no, just give us the money, we know what to do. We don't really need to do a strategic plan. So museums have been marked by independence and dependence. And they failed to see this notion of interdependence, that they really need to create a broad web of relationships with their communities, not only for their community's benefit, but for their own well-being. Because in any healthy ecological system, the relationships are all interdependent and intimate. And there was a book that was done about maybe 20 years ago called Forces for Good. And the researchers surveyed about 20 nonprofit organizations. And there was only one museum in there, and it was the Exploratorium. And they found that all the really successful ones had one thing in common, and that was that to the degree they worked outside of their institutions. They worked in their community, established relationships, met people, talked, learned. It wasn't about their strategic planning. It wasn't about their marketing department. It wasn't about the size of their budget. It was getting outside the building into the community and forging those interdependent relationships. And I'm afraid that museums are only beginning to discover the value of that, because we know that museums are not only insular within their communities in many cases, they're insular within the museum community itself.
Yeah. Yeah, well, thank you for that. I think that is very, very important. Avi, did you?
Bob, I want to jump from that very broad characterization of museums as insular to the question that it seems to me is at the heart of your book and of all of your previous books as well. And that is to what end and why? The issue, it seems, is not what museums do, but why they do it, regardless of their size or their discipline or their geographic location. There has to be an answer to the why. And you have certainly talked in very broad terms about the why. And I'd like you to elaborate on that now, to give us a piece of meat to go chew on.
Well, this may be a disappointing response because I don't think there's any prescription with respect to the answer of why, right? I mean, it's particularistic. I mean, that's one of the big strengths of the museum community is its diversity. You know, all sizes, all shapes, all budgets, all people, all knowledge bases, so much diversity. And I think that question of why will be particular to that particular institution. So I don't think there's a formula. But I think there is one universal, that question of why can only be answered when people take the time out to sit down and have that frank conversation. And that frank conversation is not going to get finished in 3 hours. You know, you better set aside some time. But that's the sort of bottom line, I think, for answering why, is to start the conversation. And I also think that it's going to require a certain amount of courage to step away to do that. And I don't know, it depends on the museum how much courage is in supply. Sometimes it's short, sometimes there's a lot of courageous museums. I mean, the Science Museum of Minnesota, for example, has a very bold, explicit statement about what it thinks about the climate crisis and what they intend to do about it. Boy, if every museum like that had that sort of statement, there'd be quite a force.
You have pointed out in previous writings a number of times that there are 3 basic agendas out there, and the third one has to do with dealing with change, and that third agenda is the one that gets most short shrift in most museums most of the time. And yet that is at the very heart of what you're prescribing. That is that you have to stop and take time for reflection about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And it seems to me that when people have those values, they're working in a kind of inverted sense of what's really important. How do you get them to change the paradigm?
Well, I mean, that's a huge question, but and in this day and age, it's all about learning. You know, I've said this several times, well, a lot in my career, that we have a lot of senior people with, say, 25, 30, 35 years experience, but it's the same year repeated 30 times or 35 times. So learning is really important. And leaders cannot feel guilty to take the time off to learn, to turn their attention away from the strife of every day, the tensions of everyday museum management, to look at the literature, get a focus, get a handle on what's going on, digest some of that, reflect some of that, talk to your colleagues, because I think that whole notion of changing the paradigm, it does in terms of the current structure of museums, it has to start at the top. Whether it's the lone CEO or a primus inter pares model of shared leadership, they're in the position to initiate that responsibility. And I think when people in the museum see it coming from the top and coming from the board, that there's going to be a natural process that will begin to unfold. But learning and becoming more reality-based are absolutely key. You know, and that makes me think that the scholar practitioner model is a very valuable one now. The museum person who does their work effectively, but also thinks, reads, publishes, and shares that information. That model is going to be very important because there's so much information now. We need enough intelligence to be able to digest what's important. But I don't think there are that many scholar practitioners in the museum world, as far as I know, but they're valuable. And I really hope that museum study schools will begin to really promote that model, because I think it's really valuable.
And actually, there are a number of very interesting scholar practitioners in the academy who are thinking about museums and libraries and kindred cultural organizations. And I'm not sure that we in the museum field draw on them sufficiently.
That's a really good point. And that makes me think of the School of Museum Studies, the Research Center for Museums and Galleries at the University of Leicester, because their real magic is that they bring together the museum academic with the museum practitioner, and they create that fertile ground where innovation really happens. So yes, I really hope the museum schools will think more about that.
Great. Colleen, do you have some questions you want us to?
I do. Well, I have one coming in from the chat that I think just perfectly dovetails with Robert's just last comments. As agents of change, is it possible that the trend of museum employees to unionize could force more rapid change? And in general, your thoughts on just unionization in general, but I would love to hear your thoughts on the museum worker being the agent of change.
Yes, I'm in full empathy, full sympathy with unionization, because it doesn't happen overnight. So obviously, the people that need to unionize have had a problem for a long time, because it's going to come with great difficulty and great challenge. So yes, I think that's a really good idea. And in the biggest institution where I work, with about 150 employees, we had a union, but it is so important not to treat it like a union, if you know what I mean. It's not we, them, it's not antithetical. These are our colleagues. And you can get into a lot of trouble when you develop that sort of bipolar approach, So we had the union president or a union representative sitting on our board of governors. After every board meeting, the minutes that were not in camera were circulated to staff, because you see in a lot of unionized organizations that it contributes to this chasm between the staff and governance, and you have to make sure you avoid that, and that's by treating the union as colleagues and not a union. But that means that the union rules still have to be respected.
Right. Bob, there's a wonderful question that's just been posted in the chat. Can you speak to the role of collections, especially for history, art, and natural history museums, where significant resources are required for the physical plants and for collections care? So, and obviously that's been one of the defining elements for museums in the 20th century and into the 21st.
Yeah.
What do we do about collections?
Well, I think that the first thing we have to do about collections is to start to examine some of our assumptions about collections. Do we really need more of these things? I've always been impressed by archives, because archives have this very democratic sense of their collections. So if they go through their collections and in Alberta and they find out that they have personal papers from someone in Yukon Territory, they give those papers to the Yukon Territory to consolidate the collection up there to make it stronger, and also to avoid redundancy in their collections. Just think how much redundancy there is in museum collections. The other thing about museum collections is they're so onerous in terms of expense, but there are ways to deal with that. At Glenbow, I admitted it costs about $400,000, but we went through 1.6 million objects, and we actually took about 38% of those collections out of the permanent collection, made them into education collections, deaccessioned them, or just got rid of them because they were in such poor condition. That reduced, we were spending about $5 million on collection age management. It reduced it by about $1.5 million. Ely Wood did a really interesting book on active collections, where we and curators are accused of being hoarders. So that's another thing to look at. What are the symptoms of hoarders with respect to this? We just have so many sacred cows about collections that we seldom sit down and challenge our own assumptions. And I think we need to do that, because all the literature says that we're not even taking care of the collections we already have in a proper way. One more thing on the climate change in collections is that there's some really interesting work done by the Canadian Conservation Institute and by a group in Amsterdam called Key Culture, which held the first International Museum Standards Conference, where they're introducing new scientific data which indicates that 48% relative humidity is not necessarily required. So there are conservators now in the world who are paying attention to the planet, and they're beginning to challenge these standards that are so expensive for museums to maintain. So again, curators of collections have to look up, look around, see what's changing, what are the trends, what are the new information.
And I think Bob, in your book you mentioned Ellie Wood, but also Rainey Tisdale and some of the questions that she suggests to ask of all collections. I wanted to talk a little bit about, I think, a prevailing notion that you've identified these 5 different types of collapse going on. But we hear often that if you're a science museum, you handle X. If you're an art museum, you have to do Y. If you're a history museum, you have to do G. One of the things that I took away from the book is how important it is for museums to bridge across those disciplines and to bridge across nature and culture, and that it's not just the province of a science museum to deal with some of these issues that we're dealing with now. Would you say a few words? We only have a few more minutes, but I'd love to talk a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, you've just said it, Marsha. I mean, that disciplinary split is not serving us. First of all, reality isn't that way. It's not just art, it's not just science, it's not just social history. All those things are components of every minutia of our daily lives. But the most important message for me in all that is that we are so divorced from the natural world. And the fact that we can now use nature, I think, has removed from our species a lot of what we once found meaningful. And we're just squandering it in the name of consumerism. And so I think every single museum of every disciplinary type has an obligation to forge that bridge with the natural world and with the planet and with the ecology and the ecological system that serve us. Art, social history, science. You can't relegate it to a particular type of museum because the health of the planet affects every single one of us, irrespective of the kind of museums we might have.
And thank you. And another point you make that I think is so relevant, I'm sure, to the people on this webinar, is that you single out small museums as maybe the best, our treasure at this point, in terms of being of community, for museum, for community, and being able to make an incredible difference in the world that we're facing now.
Indeed. I mean, small museums, and I know Avi's a fan of medium-sized museums. They're okay too. I mean, small to medium, they're my last best hope for the future. They're more nimble, and as you say, they're embedded in their communities. They're about localization. Yeah. They are my last best hope, and they're good examples. Tiny museum in Saskatchewan, I think it maybe had 2 paid employees, 3 paid employees. They got affected. The southern Saskatchewan got affected by the West Nile virus. So this little museum got out all their old mosquito fighting equipment because they've had a mosquito problem ever since there were pioneers there. But then along with that, they brought in a panel of health experts, doctors, academics, and had a whole series of public conversations based on this exhibition about how we were going to adapt to the West Nile virus. Tiny museum, totally critical social and scientific issue, and they addressed it.
Great, thank you so much. I know we have to end. One of the things I wanted to end my little piece with is a quote from your book: "Hopelessness is the springboard to helpfulness," and let's hope that that's the direction in which we're moving. Avi, did you want to say a parting word before we turn it back over to Colleen and Walter, other than thanking Robert deeply?
Bob, again, I want to thank you and thank all of those who participated in the webinar today, and Museum Expert, of course, for sponsoring the program. It does seem to me, Bob, that despite your systematic critique of museums, that you have also delivered to us an inspiring message that with thought and with openness, there is a future for museums and for those of us who work in museums.
I truly believe that. I mean, I've spent 47 years of my life working on that, and that attitude just hasn't changed. I just know things can get better.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. And thank you all for coming. We can't see you, but we know you're there.
Marsha, I'm going to jump in. Walter had a few tech issues, so I'm going to wrap us up today, if that's okay with you guys.
Well, thank you. Yeah, you're our pilot.
Yes, first,
take off and you're making it land in time.
Just patting my head and rubbing my tummy at the same time. But yes, no, I first want to thank Avi and Marsha for being, again, fantastic facilitators. You always just guide such thoughtful and well-planned conversations, and we're just ever so grateful for all that you have done for the museum community. And a huge thank you to Robert for joining us today. Having myself worked in museums for longer than I'd like to admit, you have given my brain quite a lot to think about, and I'm very excited to have the opportunity to read your book and really go through it with a fine-tooth comb and challenge some maybe historical thoughts that I have had up to this point. So again, a very huge thank you to you. I want to say to all of our attendees, thank you for joining us today. We will record this and have this recording shared on the Museum Expert YouTube page, and we're very grateful for you all. And Walter briefly mentioned that we have an upcoming workshop series that will start in November called Community in the Workplace. And this is really in response to everything the museum community has gone through since the pandemic, whether that's social justice and equity issues that are facing the museums as a whole, museum leaders who are facing pressures that maybe they hadn't faced before, and museum employees and staff who are facing, to Robert's point earlier, burnout and the pressures to do more with less and to figure out what their roles are in this new emerging museum community. So we hope that you can join us starting on November 16th for this really interesting workshop series that will alternate in opposite months. And we will be back with our regular webinar planning as well. So again, thank you all so much for your time today. We are so grateful. And as always, keep an eye out on museumexpert.org for new information on programming plans and just what's happening in the museum field today. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.